For this second video, we're going to be doing an introduction to ethics. This should be a helpful teaching tool for anyone who's taking an introduction to ethics class, or even just an intro to philosophy, because ethics, or moral theory, is a huge section within philosophical thought. So today, in order to easily summarize a lot of what ethics talks about, we're going to be talking about the three foci, or focuses, of most ethical theories. What general categories or camps do they often fall into? A great way to think about it is 3 A's. First, you've got the agent. Who is doing the action? Next, you've got the action. What is being done? And finally, you've got the aftermath. The outcomes or the consequences of that action. Most ethical theories you encounter will focus on one of these things and say that in order for something to be right or good, it has to either make you a better person, be a right action according to some rules, or come up with a good consequence or aftermath. So in order to fully explain each category, I'll be giving a real-life example of an ethical theory that falls in that category. So starting with agent, let's talk about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics comes from our best friend in ancient Greece, Aristotle. Aristotle believed that in order for you to do something that was ethically good or morally right, it had to be an action that made you a better person, that cultivated virtues within you. A virtue is basically a habit. They're things we find praiseworthy, character traits that people have that we admire, that are part of your character such that you do them over and over again. So great examples of virtues would be things like honesty. Do you tell the truth on a daily basis? Courage. Can you be relied upon to habitually be courageous? Or finally, another classic one is temperance. Basically having self-control, knowing how much to intake, how much to lay off. Now, a great metric that Aristotle talked about in order to determine what the right kind of virtue was, he called the golden mean. Like in math, the golden mean is an average. It's somewhere in between two extremes. In this case, the extremes are excess and deficiency. When you have too much of something, that's not good. When you have too little, it's also not good. What we want to be looking for is the golden mean. What is the proper amount that's in between these two extremes? So, for example, let's go back to honesty. Believe it or not, there is such thing as being too honest or having too much truth. For example, think about when you're blunt or when you shamelessly speak all of your honest thoughts, even when it runs the risk of hurting someone's feelings. That's a great example of excessiveness of honesty. You can also have deficiency. Imagine you're habitually lying or trying to deceive other people. You don't have enough honesty. But finding the golden mean in between, being honest in the right way, at the right time, to the right people, etc., that's where you find the golden mean. And again, this golden mean, the purpose of it is to make you a better agent or purpose. That's what makes something good or right. That is the foundation of virtue ethics, is an agent focus. Now let's talk about our second category, that of action. Now some might say it's not really important what kind of person you are, it's just a matter of what you do. And a great example of action-based ethics is called deontology, which really is just a fancy way of saying duty-based ethics. A popular proponent of deontology is Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher in the 1800s. Now, Kant believed that in order for an action to be right, it has to follow our duty, or follow basic rules of being humans. As long as the action is right, again, it doesn't matter what kind of person you are, and it doesn't matter what happens afterwards. As long as you have done the proper action, you have acted in an ethically right way. Now, Kant talks a lot about what kinds of actions are right or good. And we're going to be focusing on one example, which is that of autonomy. This is a huge autonomy. This is a huge buzzword in Kant's ethics, autonomy, or basic respecting freedom and liberties in other people. This is something that Kant deemed to be one of our duties. So we have to respect other people's autonomy no matter what. So even if you're in a situation, like for example, you're trying to report your taxes to the IRS, and say your family doesn't have a lot of money, it'd be really easy to lie to the IRS and say that you make less than you do so they take fewer taxes from you. But Kant would be saying that's not following your duty because you're not respecting the autonomy of the IRS by withholding information from them. So even though it has a bad consequence, or maybe it makes you a compassionate person, it would be a wrong action. So that's a great example of how Kant says that duties and rules are what are most important in ethics. Finally, let's go to our third camp, that of aftermath. Now, the poster child of any sort of consequence-based ethics is utilitarianism. The person who mainly proposed this was John Stuart Mill in the early 20th century. Now, what utilitarianism is focused on above all else are the consequences. So it doesn't matter what kind of person you are or what kind of action you take, as long as the aftermath or consequences are good, that's what makes that action right. A nice phrase that really summarizes this is, the greatest good for the greatest number. In other words, what's an action that maximizes positive things in the world, like pleasure, while simultaneously minimizes bad things like pain or suffering? As long as it maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain, that is a good consequence and thus an ethically good action under utilitarianism. A real mild kind of example of this can be used to describe a lot of parents in the United States over the last few decades. A lot of parents lie to their kids about things like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Sorry, spoiler alert. But the reason they do this, even though it makes them a dishonest person and is a bad action, they see their kids get really happy and excited around Christmas time or when they lose one of their teeth. The good consequence justifies the action. A more dramatic example of utilitarian reasoning can be used on the political spectrum. Think of things like torture. Torture is sometimes used by law enforcement officers when they know that one individual could be responsible for some sort of violence or threat on a lot of people. So when they detain one person that might know about a bomb that's going to go off and kill millions of lives, saving the million of lives justifies the torturing of one individual because they're maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. So in summary, these are three great different categories to use. So when you approach each ethical theory, think about what kind of camp does it fall into? Is it a hybrid between any two? And that might help conceptualize them and apply them differently in every situation.